we think of, in my idealistic years of thinking about America, I thought, well, we did some bad things, yes, and I'm not talking about slavery or anything else. I'm talking about things we did in war. But we had, we really didn't want to do those things. I'm not sure if any of that is true. Are the people involved in this stuff, do they recognize at all that this is evil, or is this just business?
Well, I think when you're talking about intelligence agencies, there's hierarchies. So there's like people maybe low in different levels that may think what they're doing is right and advancing American interests. But then there's people at the top that aren't necessarily like that, and it's about advancing their own interests. If you look at a lot of controversial intelligence operations and decisions, coups, for example, of the past, a lot of it was justified as going against communist influence, trying to keep that from growing. But then some of these same actors, like the Iran-Contra types, they ended up getting involved with the Chinese government just a few years later in the 1990s. And some of this blossomed into what a lot of conservatives today remember as Chinagate during the Clinton administration and things like that. So, they really have no allegiance to anything except their desire to grow their own money and power.
Are we ever going to find out who's in the black book?
I don't think so. I think the FBI has been compromised from the very beginning. In the book, I talk a lot about J. Edgar Hoover. He was blackmailed by the mob. He realized the power blackmail had, started using blackmail himself. And, increasingly the FBI, and I think it's very obvious to a lot of conservatives now, comes in to cover things up and to, go after, figures that they, don't want to advance in their careers or, any sort of thing. It's very complicated. So what do we do as a country when, there needs to be massive investigations of all sorts of stuff, Jeffrey Epstein being one, and, the government is increasingly incapable of investigating itself, especially when you're looking at the FBI or something.
Can we go through some names like Alan Dershowitz and Bill Clinton and Donald Trump? What were they involved in? So each of those cases is really different. But if I'm looking at, I guess the one that's gotten the most attention, obviously, are the former presidents, right? Trump and Clinton. As far as I'm concerned, the Clinton-Epstein relationship is much more damaging than the Trump-Epstein relationship. But there, are obvious reasons for concern in both of them. And I don't think it's, in trying to be objective, I can't absolve one or the other. But are you saying... Are you saying because one is more damaging? Because people don't understand. It's not just the horrific, evil sex trafficking that was going on. It's also massive corruption
and financial
crimes.
And that's particularly glaring with the Epstein-Clinton relationship. You have someone like Jeffrey Epstein that described himself in the 80s as a financial bounty hunter. He was hiding or finding looted money for powerful people. That's coming from him. And he said this to numerous people. There's numerous sources attesting to this. So obviously he was very comfortable with the offshore financial system, shadow banking, and all of that. And then in the late 80s, in addition to becoming involved with Leslie Wexner's finances, he is involved in orchestrating one of the largest Ponzi schemes in U.S. history. The other person he worked with in that, Stephen Hoffenberg, is arrested and goes to jail for that in 1993. Epstein's name is dropped from the case, and he ends up at Clinton White House fundraisers. And one of those fundraisers is involved Hillary Clinton's alleged effort to refurbish the White House. And this makes a brief appearance in Vince Foster's quote-unquote suicide note. The only mention of Hillary Clinton in that suicide note is relating to her and Khaki Hawker-Smith redecorating and how there was nothing wrong with the finances there. If you're... listeners are familiar with the Vince Foster situation and how Hillary Clinton, her office, was involved in finding the suicide note when there was nothing in the briefcase and all of that later. It's very interesting. The only mention of her name would be in trying to absolve that particular fundraiser of, any wrongdoing, which would have been Foster's responsibility. And that's Jeffrey Epstein's, one of his first interactions with the White House. There's a picture of him shaking hands with Bill Clinton at that fundraiser donor reception. And only UK media covered that when it came out last December.
I got to tell you.
It's pretty stunning.
I only see stuff that I kind of trust from UK now. If there's any scandal going on in America,
I trust the foreign press more than I trust our press.
Well, isn't it stunning that there's a picture of, the claim has been for a long time that the Epstein-Clinton relationship only really began after Clinton left office.
Yeah.
And then you have a picture contradicting that, and it doesn't get any coverage.
So how does...
There's something else there, obviously.
I was shocked to learn from you that Ron Brown, I remember, he was a guy who was on a plane going someplace...
Croatia.
Yeah, Croatia. And it crashed, and everybody was like, it's another Clinton murder. And I've never really bought into you wouldn't have to push me far, but I'm a fact guy, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Show me the facts.
Well, it's a lot to unravel to understand the Ron Brown situation because it's tied up with what I mentioned earlier, Chinagate, which was very difficult even for Congress to investigate. The man at the center of it, who was also the man that Jeffrey Epstein met with repeatedly at the White House, named Mark Middleton, he pleaded the Fifth 28 times, including to the question was he a foreign agent? And pretty much every key figure they tried to subpoena also pleaded the Fifth. And there was just... it was very difficult to investigate. And even the George W. Bush administration, the first invocation of executive privilege of Bush as president was, among other things, to block documents about Mark Middleton being made available to Congress. And then 9/11 happens and everyone forgets.
Wow.
It's very amazing because Mark Middleton was not a high-ranking guy. He was an aide to Mac McLarty, who was chief of staff and then a senior advisor to Bill Clinton. So why are you having the subsequent president stepping in for Mark Middleton? There's obviously a lot going on there because at the same time that Mark Middleton is involved in Chinagate, he's meeting with Jeffrey Epstein, and Jeffrey Epstein in that period of time is arranging for the relocation of Southern Air Transport, the Iran-Contra airline, instead of going from Miami to Latin America, it starts going from Columbus, Ohio, where Leslie Wexner is based, to Hong Kong. So are those events connected? I make a case for that in the book. And if true, it's very, very disconcerting because basically, to summarize Chinagate, you have a mass transfer of sensitive U.S. military technology being made to China. It's being paid for by the PLA or the Chinese military. And Ron Brown was at the center of that because the Commerce Department was signing off on, all sorts of...
And so why was he then... supposedly killed?
He, shortly before he was unexpectedly asked to go on a trade mission to Croatia, he agreed to cooperate with an investigation into this particular network that was executing Chinagate. And the people on the U.S. side that were facilitating Chinagate were people that were connected to the networks of longtime Clinton benefactors, the Riadi family, and Jackson Stevens, who, were sort of political makers for Bill Clinton when he was governor of Arkansas. It's crazy.
How much of what we think we know is wrong, or how big of a role is what we think we know to what really is happening?
Well, I think there's been a major effort to control the media and how much information gets to the American public about all sorts of things. If you look at the Epstein case, you're only allowed to talk about his sex crimes from 2000 to 2006. Don't look at his financial crimes or any of the thing he did before the year 2000 is, pretty much how mainstream media handles the case. And that's pretty, there's a lot to find if you go back farther.
So when you're looking, let's just look at Epstein for a second. When you're looking at his circle of influence, he is somebody who's kind of recruiting, just getting people on tape doing horrible things or raising money so they're in the pocket, right? Is that kind of his role?
I think that's part of it, but at the same time, he's doing a lot of that. He's also involved in financial crimes pretty much throughout his career. I mean, that's the common thread from Epstein from the 70s until his second arrest.
But they would know that if he was working as an operation, that would kind of be overlooked.
I think it was known. I mean, even in January 2020, you have John McCain's wife, Cindy McCain, saying, we all knew what Epstein was doing.
Right.
And this is the wife of a senator with no direct connection to the Epstein scandal. So that means top people in our Congress and Senate knew what Epstein was up to, and nothing was done.
And so does that, is there a big body count?
Around Epstein?
Yeah.
I think there is to an extent. Mark Middleton, who I just mentioned, was found hung by the neck by an extension cord in May with a shotgun wound to the chest. And it was ruled a suicide in Little Rock, Arkansas. And a local court ruled pretty shortly thereafter that no video or, photos of the scene could be publicly released. And this was only after... Mark Middleton had been involved in Chinagate and numerous other scandals, but that only happened just a few months after the visitor logs of him meeting with Epstein was released last December, published by the UK's Daily Mail.
So that's one. But
That's one recently. You also have Jean-Luc Brunel, who was a major facilitator of his sex trafficking activities, particularly when it came to the modeling industry. Turned up dead in his prison cell. You have Epstein himself, and then you have the son of Esther Salas, who was the judge overseeing the Epstein Deutsche Bank case, murdered at her home.
Let's not just gloss over Epstein and his death. Do you believe he hung himself?
I think the official story is just, it's crazy, personally, because, he was a tall guy. He's supposed to have hung himself from something that's shorter than his standing height with like paper thin sheets. He would have had to curl up in the fetal position to hang himself. And he's,
You're not going to do that.
It's very, it's logistically impossible. We're supposed to believe all the cameras malfunctioned that night. The prison guards were asleep. It's a lot of coincidences.
So who would we have to believe? I mean, that would have to involve lots of government. Government.
But he belonged to intelligence. And if you look at, someone like Robert Maxwell, he died off of his yacht. He had a lot of ties to intelligence. Things were, the walls were closing in on him, and his own daughter, Ghislaine Maxwell, thinks he was murdered by rogue Mossad agents and Sicilian contract hitmen. And that's coming straight from his daughter that worked closely with him. So if if things get too hot, if you, maybe did work for them in the past, but you become, more of a liability than an asset, things sometimes happen.